Hello, everyone. We are in for the third video for the month of January. As I had mentioned last week, I did not know at the time what video we were going to begin to cover. I kind of took a little bit of searching to kind of look at topics that I felt, hadn't been touched upon yet. What would be something that we could touch upon to kind of fill the gap in between now and the last video of the month, which is always the president's video at the end. And the topic that I came across would be one delving a little bit into Irish history. It's been a while since we come onto a topic of that subject. And back in 2023, I had done, I want to say, I think it was four of them, four videos I had done on different topics in Irish history. I had done the rebellion in 1798. I had done the potato famine. I had done the Irish War of Independence that had kind of finally got Ireland somewhat away from English rule. I had covered the Irish Civil War that followed right after, which was kind of tragic how the winners of the war pretty much got divided right after and ended up fighting with each other. And that came about at the time because over since 2022, I would say I have become quite enamored with Irish culture, with Irish history. I hope to goodness one day I can hopefully go see the country myself. I'd love to. I have ancestors that came from there. But nonetheless, a topic that I felt I didn't cover at that time that I felt would be appropriate to cover now because it would correlate with what has previously been covered in other videos is a topic that is a lot more recent, but also a topic that correlates with the aftermath of the Civil War and the Irish War of Independence, and that would be what we know as the Troubles. Now, the Troubles, of course, is an ethno-nationalist period of conflict that happened between 1968 and 1998. Technically, that was the end date. There was some stuff that came afterwards, like 2005-ish. So it's also quite into a little bit into modern day, like not that long ago history. But the Troubles is kinda left its scar on both Northern Ireland, where it primarily took place, which is that part of Ireland still under English rule, or British rule, I should just say, and the Republic of Ireland. It's left a scar on the relations between both of those 2 different areas, and to this day, there is still some tensions that exist, and there's questions over, the future of what Northern Ireland's future is gonna be. And I felt that would be a topic that would be appropriate to take a look at today. So what we're going to do is take an overview look. I know there's finer details you could really get into this, but we're going to do a general overview as much as we can, but try to include as many details as is feasibly possible. And take a look at where does this all start? Why did it happen? What exactly happened? And how does it eventually come to an end? And, the aftermath of it. So the Troubles can trace its origins really to two major events in Irish history. We will discuss the second here we will discuss the second reason here in a minute. But for the first reason, we got to go back almost 800 years, pretty much 800 years. For those of you who are not aware of Irish history, Ireland was long dominated for over 800 years by the English, and in many ways there are some people in Ireland to this day that would still claim that Ireland is not yet entirely free because part of the island is still part of the UK. But back in the late 12th century, we're going back to the late 1100s. Think of the situation here. The Gaels, the native Gaelic peoples in Ireland, have remained kind of cut off from the world. I mean, they've engaged with trade and other things, but they've largely been left to their own affairs. Their next door neighbor, England and the British Isles, have now been, at this point, super conquered. The Anglo Saxons at that point have been conquered by the invading Normans. And the Normans are subjugating the native populations in England. They're subjugating the native populations in Wales and in Scotland. They're trying to move into Scotland. That didn't exactly work out immediately. And that would be another video we could look at is how Scotland and England become one in terms of monarchy. But we'll look at that in the future. But the Normans, by the late 1100s, the Anglo-Normans, as we'll call them, because they're starting to get to the point that before too long the two cultures are going to start merging into modern English. They come across into Ireland and start invading the island of Ireland. And the native Gaels are subjugated. They're put out of power in certain areas of the island, and they're thus classed as second-class citizens. When the Anglo-Normans come over, they bring colonial settlers with them to settle new settlements in Ireland. And these settlers, these earliest settlers, are what we end up knowing as Old English in Ireland. These are the Old English settlers. Now, this was the start of where this problem is going to occur. It's not quite yet a problem, but it will be because religion's going to get thrown into the mix. Now, as we mentioned, over a period following this of 800 years, there are these Anglo-Norman or English for sake, English slash British, we'll say that for sake of purpose. There's these English slash British plantations in Ireland. Now, these are not exactly like a sugarcane plantation in the Caribbean. These are, yes, they are farms, but they're almost like these private farm tracts at times. And what ends up happening is England establishes these plantations in the different areas of Ireland that they have settlers that end up settling and, actually living there on the island. It's their version of colonization. These settlements, these plantation settlers are often run by Protestants and they're often owned by Protestants. Catholics are not really allowed to own plantations, and in many cases, Catholics are barred from taking part in public government. They are barred from taking part in land ownership. They are barred from having any representation in government merely due to their Catholicism. Now, this became much later because, mind you, at first, both of them would have followed the same church, but after the Reformation in the 1500s, England, as we well know, because of King Henry VIII wanting to get a divorce from his wife, ends up becoming Protestant. And Protestants and Catholics in history tend to not get along that well to the point it causes wars and civil wars and all kinds of messy, the, the bad, gory parts of history. I mean, it just goes on and on. But these plantations are run by Protestants, and Catholics, by effect, are largely excluded from the ruling class. And that is a big problem because the Catholics are native to Ireland. The Irish people are predominantly, even to this day, predominantly most Irish people, if they have religion, are Catholic by faith, not Protestant. And that is going to end up causing a problem moving forward. Now, I had covered some of this back in one of the previous videos I had done on some of the topics that had come about. But we're reviewing it a little bit here because it's going to come into great play as to why there is this conflict that ends up happening in Northern Ireland. Now, the most successful plantations that ended up being established by the English were those in the Irish province of Ulster. Ulster is one of the four historic provinces of Ireland, the other ones being Leinster, Munster, and Connacht. And Ulster is in the far north, and Ulster, a majority of the counties that make up Ulster are today part of Northern Ireland. They're still part of the UK, only like three of them, I believe. Three counties are actually part of the Republic of Ireland, which is Ireland itself, the country at least. It's not part of the UK. But the plantations in Ulster were primarily settled starting at the time that they come to settle, they're primarily settled by English and Scottish farmers. These are coming from heavily Protestant areas. They're not likely to adopt Catholicism as a faith, and they're not likely to get along with the locals. Now, as the Catholic Irish sought to fight the Protestant hegemony that was developing on their island under English rule, and eventually, seeking home rule, seeking independence, those in Ulster ended up developing. Ulster developed as a region of basically Protestants starting to actually outnumber the Catholics. And in the 16th century in particular, a lot of the Scottish and English settlers that were coming in about the 1600s actually didn't really assimilate with the Irish that already were living there. They pretty much held on to their British identities. They held on to their Protestant faith and their loyalty to the British crown. So Ulster, by the time of the early 20th century, it's not really I'm trying to think of how to put I mean, there's only one way to put it. It's not really Irish, not like some of the other provinces are. It's got a good sizable majority of these English people who are of not Irish descent, but of English and Scottish descent and are thus Protestant, and thus it is probably the only province in Ireland that has a majority of Protestant population, and that is going to cause problems when Ireland tries to break away. That is the first cause of this, is England, through 800 years of rule, kind of instigates this Protestant settlement in Ireland that ends up kind of actually becoming quite established, well rooted, and it's going to cause a problem moving forward. The other problem being the same problem that kind of caused the Irish Civil War, the partition of Ireland, which, for those of you not familiar with, we will go through a little bit how that happened, at least slightly. The Irish War of Independence that ended up beginning about 1918, 1919 would end up dividing the island's inhabitants. It wasn't just a war between the native Irish peoples and the British government, it was a war against Irish, because some Irish peoples were not willing to oppose the crown, others were. And this was very much a civil war as much as it was a war of independence, not that much different from, say, here in the United States. When we had our American Revolution against Great Britain, the colonies were not entirely united against fighting Great Britain for independence. We had colonists that we called Loyalists that were pro Britain. They didn't want to see any reason to rebel against the crown. And after the war, they fled to Canada because obviously the Patriots ended up winning the war. They didn't want to live here anymore, so they went to Canada. Same situation. There was a civil war going on just as much as there was a war for independence going on. Ulster was divided at that time into 9 counties. 4 had loyalist majorities in Antrim, Down, Armagh, and Londonderry. And then you had 2 of them that had Protestant majorities, which were Fermanagh and Tyrone. And then 3 of those remaining counties, 3 of them had Catholic nationalist majorities. So those 3 that had Catholic majorities, obviously, they're going to become part of the Republic of Ireland, and that's the counties of Donegal, Cavan, and Monaghan. Now, in 1920, during the height of the Irish War of Independence, the British Parliament would respond to Ulster Loyalist wishes who were concerned over what was going to happen to them should the Irish actually manage to win this Irish War of Independence. They did not want to be part of this Irish state that they were trying to proclaim, this Irish Republic. They thought that if we live in a country governed by the Irish, we will lose our British identity. We will lose, our special privileges to the land that we have. We'll lose our religion. They feared losing their culture if they were included in a united Ireland, and they did not want to be part of that. So they start pleading with Parliament to do something because they are scared to death of what's going to happen. And the British Parliament would respond in 1920 to those wishes by enacting the Government of Ireland Act. The act would divide Ireland into 2 self governing areas, with 6 counties forming one area in Northern Ireland and the other 26 forming another. And that is going to be basically the start of Northern Ireland. Now, it was not officialized until 1921. 1921 would be the officialization of this partition because of the Anglo-Irish treaty that was signed in December of 1921 that would officially end the war, but at the same time caused quite the stir. As part of the Anglo-Irish treaty, Ireland would be partitioned in 2. 26 Catholic majority counties were granted Dominion status as the Irish Free State on their own, which eventually would become the Irish Republic when they finally broke away from being any part of the British Commonwealth. Those 6 northern counties of Ulster were given the option in the treaty. It was not mandated, but it was given the option, and because Britain very well knew which direction they were going to go, the 6 northern counties were given the option of remaining in the United Kingdom if they so chose to do so, of course, which they did as Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland would be granted self-governance status in 1922, much to the anger of a lot of members of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, that had fought against Britain for a couple years up to that point, who who then started a civil war at home in the Republic of Ireland because they viewed that, those that were willing to accept the treaty, this was a betrayal of what we had started out fighting for, because in 1916 we proclaimed an Irish Republic made up of the entire island of Ireland. We're not accepting this British partition that was imposed. While the other half correctly is saying, you know, like, we understand what you're saying. Like, we want a united Ireland too, but we barely achieved this. So it's better to take the deal that we have now and hope for reunification at a later date, full unification. Independence is first. Unification can wait. And that ended up spawning the Irish Civil War, which was largely in the Republic of Ireland. Northern Ireland gets away with it. Now, Northern Ireland upon its formation, it was about two-thirds Protestant and about one-third Catholic. It is very much a Protestant-dominated state. About 1 million of its inhabitants were Catholic or Protestant, and only about 500,000 of them were Catholic by faith. Now, Belfast and other cities that were located in Northern Ireland would actually attract migrants from across the island, both from within Northern Ireland itself and from the Republic of Ireland to the south. And a lot of these migrants came to the big cities in Northern Ireland, like Belfast, in search of jobs. They needed work, and there was good work to be had. Belfast in itself is infamous for its shipbuilding well, not infamous, but I should say famous for its shipbuilding industry, of which spawned great, magnificent liners for literally decades, including perhaps most infamously in this case, the RMS Titanic. But Belfast has a lot of jobs to be had, and a lot of other Irish cities do as well, and Northern Irish, and that attracts a lot of migrants in search of work. And the best jobs often went to Protestants because of discrimination in the hiring process. Protestants often got the best jobs in Northern Ireland, and Catholics pretty much act like, oh, they're not as important, even though Catholics still made up a pretty sizable majority in this new Protestant state. They kind of wanted to act like, oh, yeah, we're 100% Protestant. Dude, you still have a sizable Catholic minority in your state. You need to be recognizing that. Northern Ireland would remain firmly under Protestant Loyalist rule in the following decade for about the next 40 years, mostly led by the Ulster Unionist Party. And there was also gerrymandering of electoral districts in Northern Ireland in order to keep Catholics minimized in representation. Basically, they wanted to exclude the Catholics as they had for 800 years. 800 years, we'd gotten away with kind of keeping them out of land ownership. We'd gotten away with kind of making sure they were represented in government. Why can't we continue the practice? Because UK backs us, we're part of the UK still, we can do what we want. The Catholics were also very limited on their voting as well. They often could not find that they often found that they were restricted on their voting compared to Protestants because one of the things for voting was only ratepayers, which was the tax-paying heads of households, could vote along with their spouses. Since Catholic households often were much larger and often were more likely to have unemployed adult children who were not the head of the house, even though they were adults, even though they were adults, they weren't the head of the house, thus they could not vote. And since Catholic households tended to be more likely to be like that, it ended up costing the Catholics votes when it came to elections. Ratepayers who paid for more than one residence could actually be granted up to 5 additional votes, and since Protestants were more likely to be able to own multiple residences due to, land ownership laws, this also ensured that Protestants would thus have more votes than Catholics would when it came to elections. It was a pretty dirty way of doing things, really. Now, Catholics in Northern Ireland would claim to be discriminated against in multiple areas. It wasn't just elections that they were being discriminated against. They also argued that they were being discriminated against in the allocation of public housing, appointments to public service jobs. They were being excluded for those, and government investment in neighborhoods, where it seemed like the government was much more willing to put money to help build up neighborhoods that were Protestant majority than it was to, give funding toward improving neighborhoods that were made up of a Catholic majority. Now, police harassment, of course, did also exist. There was police harassment by the exclusively Protestant Royal Ulster Constabulary and the Ulster Special Constabulary were also in play here, but both of those police forces in Northern Ireland were very heavily made up of Protestants, and they more than else tended to harass local Catholics whenever they could. The divide between Catholics and Protestants also dealt with the culture and politics more than it did with the religion itself. It wasn't. You might think, okay, they're arguing because of difference in religion. Well, that wasn't the whole thing. It's because of who's associated with each one. Depending on what religion you are, you also tended to be associated with something else culturally. Those who identified as Catholic tended to be Irish, native Irish, while those who were Protestant tended to be those descendants of those English and Scottish plantation owners, and thus had very much a British identity. They didn't really have an Irish cultural identity, and thus there was a difference in culture. During Before the Troubles, and I think it's still very limited today, but before the Troubles, Irish history and language was not taught in Northern Ireland, despite it being on the island, and it was also illegal to fly the flag of the Irish Republic to their south, partly because of the factor that the Republic was still openly hostile to Britain in many ways, and in their constitution, they even claimed sovereignty over the whole island still. And thus it was kind of seen as a possible enemy right to the south. And Sinn Féin, which was the party of Irish republicanism, was actually banned in Northern Ireland between the years of 1956 and 1974. Now, Catholics would often identify, as we said, as Irish, and they sought Northern Ireland's incorporation into the Republic of Ireland. They wanted a united Ireland. They didn't want to be living under this Protestant rule that they felt was, British hegemony, that this needs to be broken, and I don't want to be, we need to be away. Well, as we mentioned, Protestants' fear incorporation would lead to them losing their culture and their British privilege. For about 40 years after the partition of Ireland in 1921, 1922, things remained relatively stable in Northern Ireland. There's massive problems when it comes to discrimination toward Irish Catholics, but there's also not a whole lot of like violence going on. That would change. That will change with the 1960s as they come into fruition. So here, before we continue, here we have a map. I think I've shown this one before, but just in case anyone's not familiar with the current borders of Ireland, this is the island of Ireland. To this day, this is a correct map. And the green is the Republic of Ireland. That is what was granted. Those are the counties that made up the Irish Free State that later became the Republic of Ireland when they got out of the British Commonwealth. And that is the country of Ireland. Now, that yellow portion, that is those 6 counties that Britain kind of partitioned out because they were majority Protestant and Loyalist, and thus kind of kept them within the UK. They're still part of the UK to this day. That is Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is where a majority of the troubles is going to happen, is up in here. Not so much down here, but up here. Put that right there. Let me see if I have any others that I want to go through quickly here. I don't think yet. No. So in the 1960s, a new generation of Catholics is going to start seeking more equitable government in Northern Ireland, as they are now a new generation that's come up to adulthood in this era of change. The 1960s, as we all know, is a very big era of change. In the United States, we have John F. Kennedy and the new Camelot that he brought in. We also have other movements that are moving. We have the civil rights movements that are really starting to gain speed, and that is going to be one big thing. The 1960s is a big decade of political activism, and that is going to be a main driver of what's going to end up happening. Now, there were Catholic activists in Northern Ireland who would actually come together to form civil rights groups, mostly inspired by uprisings in other European countries like Prague Spring and Hungary. Well, not Hungary, but Czechoslovakia. I always get that wrong off the bat. And then we have, I believe there was some in France, and probably most famously, you have the African American civil rights movement that is ongoing in the 1960s in the United States. So these Catholic activists in Northern Ireland end up coming together to form civil rights groups. Perhaps the most important of those was the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, or the NICRA, the NICRA. The catalyzing event that most historians will agree started the modern Troubles period happened in Derry, or Londonderry, on October 5th, 1968. This is when the Troubles is generally thought to have officially begun. There was a scheduled NICRA march that was organized to protest discrimination in gerrymandering that was set for that day in Londonderry. Unfortunately, a bunch of the local Unfortunately for them, a bunch of local unionists had learned of this planned march, and they had organized and announced they were going to be doing a counter protest whenever this protest ended up happening. And because of this, and the government kind of not wanting conflict, they ordered that the Negro March was to be banned because they did not want the chance of any kind of blood, any kind of rioting, any kind of fist fights. They didn't want no violence in the streets. Defying the ban, the Negro March continued anyway, and it led to riots when the Royal Ulster Constabulary, or the RUC or Rook, would violently suppress marchers with batons and water cannons to try to keep them off. Another march was also held by Loyalists in Londonderry on August 12th of 1969, with which then ensued with 2 days of rioting between Protestant and Catholic neighborhoods, which we know at commonly know as the Battle of Bogside, named after the local neighborhood that it really occurred in there. With the RUC kind of acting as this buffer. In both instances, the RUC ended up having to kind of act as this buffer a lot of times between the Catholics and Protestants who are wanting to go at each other. And this ends up kind of creating a very hostile situation where because the Catholics are starting to actually protest over the discrimination they're facing in Northern Ireland, the Protestants don't like that. And much like Southern whites did back in the United States when African Americans started to do that, they start trying to exercise force against them by counter protesting and rioting and everything else. Now, at first, I can say that I think the Irish Catholics had right with them. But as this conflict is going to evolve, we're going to rapidly see that turns very quickly south because both sides end up doing some very despicable things. Most notably, we have the Provos, which we'll get to them. The rioting would also erupt in Belfast and other major cities in Northern Ireland, which would actually lead to the British Army getting dispatched in order to try to restore calm to the situation, to try to restore some sense of calm to what was going on. So the nationalists, or the Irish Catholics, but we're going to call them nationalists because they're in favor of a united Ireland. The nationalists at first actually welcomed the British Army when they were sent to kind of intervene in this ongoing rioting and everything that was happening. They came to be viewed, however, as another version of the enemy. At first, they viewed them as protectors who were going to come in and kind of help them out, keep them safe from these Protestant agitators. The Protestants thought the same thing. They're going to keep us safe from the Catholic agitators. However, that the nationalists rapidly came to view the British Army as complacent with their enemies due to the efforts to disarm Republican paramilitaries, but they weren't really doing it to disarm Unionist ones. And they very rapidly kind of realized the British aren't really helping here. They're just kind of falling in line with the Protestants. The IRA in Ireland actually would end up becoming a defender of the Republican cause. Now, the Irish Republican Army, after the Irish Civil War, had ended up splitting in two. Now, half of the faction ended up becoming part of the Republic of Ireland's government. The other remaining faction that had fought against the government in the Civil War remained alive after the Civil War had ended in about 1922. And that faction of the IRA continued to fight this guerrilla campaign for decades against both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland because they were still adamant that the treaty was illegal and they still wanted to maintain that the Irish Republic proclaimed in 1916 encompasses the whole of Ireland, so neither state is legitimate. So even after losing the Civil War, there's still this gang of IRA people out there that are still operating under the IRA flag that are arguing that, we are still going, we're still fighting this war. This has never ended. And in the 1960s, that was no different. They were still around. So they see this opportunity in Northern Ireland and they start to try to come to the defense of the nationalists. They want to defend the nationalist cause. However, they hadn't always put the best of funding as they were more concerned with the Republic of Ireland, and thus they had a very weak guerrilla campaign in Northern Ireland in the years prior to the breakout of the Troubles from 1956 to 62. However, by the late 1960s, the IRA, the original what was left of that faction that had split off after the Civil War, they had started to become very obsessed with the idea of Marxist ideology. Yes, communism. And they're starting to really go into the factor of ending the guerrilla campaigns and move toward trying to advance this Marxist ideology wherever they could. And it ends up causing quite a stir within their ranks. And this stir ends up culminating in the late 1960s because a splinter group that is heavily in support of the nationalist cause up in Northern Ireland comes out of the official IRA, that they end up naming themselves the Provisional IRA, or as we commonly know them as Provos. Provisional Provos. And the Provos emerge as the splinter group off of this old faction of the IRA left over from the Civil War. They're willing to use force to bring about Irish unification. They don't much care how it gets done. They don't care who they got to kill. They don't care who they got to fight. They will get it done. And they kind of go and start becoming the major paramilitary force for the nationalists up in Northern Ireland. Now, the provisional IRA saw their fight, as we mentioned, they see it pretty much as a continuation, much like the group that they had broke off from. They saw their fight as simply a continuation of the Irish War of Independence, that we're simply trying to liberate these last six provinces of British rule. They also received financing and support from a wide array of sources. Libya, under Muammar Gaddafi, was one of them that supplied them with a lot of money and a lot of weapons. And perhaps one that is a little more surprising is possibly the biggest financial backer that they had was the widespread Irish diaspora across the world, most notably the Irish diaspora in the United States. Yes, there were tons of Irish Americans in the United States who were extremely sympathetic to the Irish nationalist cause in Northern Ireland and actually began shipping in money and guns and weapons and everything that they possibly could to help them out. This also happened in countries like Australia and New Zealand and Canada. So it's quite surprising they got involved as well, simply because they wanted the best for their ancestral homeland. Now, while the official IRA did support the nationalists in Northern Ireland for a time. It called a ceasefire in 1972 and ended up ceding the title of IRA there to the Provos that pretty much were running the whole operation at that point in an attempt to largely distance themselves. And the provisional IRA at first is going to go and engage heavily in guerrilla warfare, which is going to make the troubles even worse. Unionists, in response, would also begin to take up arms in the form of their own paramilitary organizations, two of the most notable being the Ulster Volunteer Force, or the UVF, and the Ulster Defense Association, or the UDA. Now, the Northern Irish government, seeing the rising tensions that is starting to occur in the late 1960s to early 1970s, they try to relieve nationalist grievances immediately by trying to redraw the electoral boundaries fairly. They would also try to end discrimination in housing and public employment, and also decide at the same time that while we will do these to try to reform the system, there also needs to be some security measures taken. And one of the most controversial security measures that they do is what we call internment, which was detention without trial, which was begun to counter the unrest that was rapidly growing. However, internment massively backfires because a lot of those who are arrested are Catholics, not Protestants. And not to say that the Protestants weren't, not to say that the Catholics weren't doing stuff, but it does seem as though there was still some discrimination going on. The 1970s would see riots become frequent in the cities of Belfast and Londonderry, as well as the bombings of public places becoming a very common thing as well. Barbed wire boundaries that had been laid by British soldiers between neighborhoods ended up being turned into brick and steel walls over 45 feet high that were termed peace walls to divide Protestant neighborhoods from Catholic ones in order to try to stop them from fighting with each other. And we do have a couple images, I think, of those events. Yes, yes, we do. So this would be one here. Oh, we have a couple things that we'll put here. We'll show that one right now. And I think we'll also show these two because I think they're relevant to right now. And these paramilitaries often operated almost like gangs with each other, I might add, in some of these neighborhoods. They very much operated on the pretense of, this is our territory, and people of the rival gang aren't welcome here. If you come here, we will kill you. And they operated very much on that pretense in many ways. Now, this is a picture from the Battle of Bogside back in 1969. I believe it was 1969, right at the very start of the troubles of those riders kind of actually engaging with the local police forces. And that ended up going south pretty bad. Now, here's one thing that I'm talking about where they act like it was a gang territory. I'm not kidding. They would write this on the walls. You could be walking in a city in Northern Ireland and you would see what this one says: "You are now in Protestant territory." with something else below it that we just can't see from the image. But you would see graffiti elsewhere. You see what you're entering Catholic territory, you're entering Provo territory. It's just not something you wanted to really see about. Now, here is an image of one of those peace walls. And there's actually quite a few of these peace walls still standing to this day in a lot of Northern Irish cities, even though the Troubles have been over for a while now. But this was one of them that's still standing between two neighborhoods. One was Catholic and one was Protestant. And in an effort to try to keep them from fighting with each other, they built this big wall between them. What started as barbed wire ended up getting turned into this massive steel and brick structure. And do we have any others right now, or do I want to wait on those? Yeah, we'll wait on those. On June 30th, 1972, the perhaps the bloodiest day of the entire Troubles period ended up coming about, and that was the Bloody Sunday incident. On the Bloody Sunday incident, they were British paratroopers who ended up coming into the city of Londonderry, and they openly fired on a assembled crowd of Catholic civil rights demonstrators that they came upon, thinking that they were a threat. It was later revealed in documents and investigations that they had not been a threat, and Britain later actually would issue an official apology in 2010 for the incident. But on that January day in 1972, they would actually fire on these protesters, killing 13 of them and injuring another 14. Provo recruitment in Northern Ireland as a result of Bloody Sunday would spike to the highest levels that it had been since the start of the entire conflict. And the incident would remain controversial even to this day, even though Britain officially apologized and said that the soldiers had been in the wrong to open fire in 2010. It still has quite a few people that remember it and hold it as a very controversial event to this day. 1972 would end up being the deadliest year of the Troubles as a whole, with over 480 people killed, and over 100 of those 480 people were British soldiers that were being killed as well. Bloody Friday would also take place that same year on July 21st, which would see 9 killed when 24 bombs ended up being detonated in Belfast by the Provos, probably as some sort of retaliation for possibly Bloody Sunday earlier in the year. Now, due to the Northern Irish government's inability to calm the situation that was occurring, its parliament was ended up being suspended in 1972. I believe it was in March of that year it actually had been suspended, and direct rule from Westminster had to be imposed for the first time since the Irish War of Independence. The Provos, in response in the 1970s, would also start to shift their tactics to a long war that during that decade. They would do less and less direct engagements with British troops and local Unionist paramilitaries and move to more secretive operations like bombings and assassinations in both Britain and Northern Ireland itself, and even some in the Republic of Ireland when they could. That many of these acts were simply what we would classify nowadays as acts of terrorism, which is where the cause starts go a little quite a bit south. By 1976, 300 between the period in the period between 1974 and 1976, approximately 370 Catholics had died and 88 Protestants had also died during that 2-year time frame. And I am going to look up here. Just overall, by the time this was all done, when the Troubles was complete in Ireland, I did not look it up initially, but how many people overall died in the Troubles? It's estimated. Let's see here. It is estimated to this day that approximately more than 3,500 people actually ended up getting killed during the Troubles conflict. 52% of those deaths were civilians, with about 32% British security forces. So it's estimated over about 3,500 people ended up dying in this 30-year, ethno-nationalist conflict that erupts in Northern Ireland, simply over arguments and discrimination and everything else that ends up occurring in between. The remainder of the 1970s would see violence continue absolutely unabated in Northern Ireland. Lord Mountbatten, who had been a very famous naval admiral back in the Second World War, had been a viceroy of India, and was related to Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. He ends up actually getting assassinated at sea. He was living in Ireland for a time, and he would go out in his boat. And at one point, there had been an IRA sniper, a Provos sniper, that had actually been trying to snipe him off his boat, but because of the weather, he was unable to actually get a good sight on him and thus failed. What ended up happening was he went out on his boat with a couple of his family and friends, and an IRA had planted a bomb on the boat, and the bomb blew. And Mountbatten ended up getting killed along with a lot of the other people on the boat. I can't remember if anyone actually survived, but that would have been 1979. And in beginning in 1976, the IRA prisoners were treated as common criminals instead of POWs. Before 1976, when when the British security forces had taken provisional IRA prisoners, they tended to treat them as prisoners of war, and they got the treatment that a prisoner of war of a sovereign nation would get. However, after 1976, Britain kind of comes to the conclusion, well, they're not fighting for the Republic of Ireland because they're also fighting against them. These are, well, Britain, I believe, classified them as terrorists even then. So Britain's arguing these aren't worthy of being treated as POWs. They're to be treated like a common criminal. Why would we grant them special privileges in prison? The prisoners ended up protesting this with two different protests. The first one was what we call the blanket protest. The blanket protest ended up, they were told that when they went into prison, these IRA prisoners, you are to wear the prison uniforms. They were handed the prison uniforms. This is what you will wear. They refused to wear the prison uniforms. Instead, the IRA prisoners would only wear blankets around them for clothing. When this protest didn't quite work, in order to get them back what they had wanted and meet their demands, they had the dirty protest. And the dirty protest was a little more nasty, if we want to know the truth. I had never heard of a protest like this until today. And oh my goodness. I had to add this in there when I actually found it because I had heard about it, but I didn't know why they called it the dirty one. And the dirty protest, it happened in 1978. The inmates ended up going partly on a hunger strike, but at the same time, they, they I mean, just blatantly, and there's even pictures of it. It's worse. During the dirty protests, the inmates would actually smear their feces on the walls of the cells that they were in, and they refused to take baths or showers. They would not bathe. They would not clean themselves. It's just nasty. But it was their way of protesting. And the new British Prime Minister in the late 70s, going into the 1980s, is none other than Margaret Thatcher. And I know Margaret Thatcher's got a lot of people out there who absolutely hate her guts. I am conflicted over what my view is of her, because she did, I think, some slight good things, but I also see a lot of bad things that she did. So she's a very controversial figure, one way or another, kind of like Napoleon in any regard. But Margaret Thatcher and her government refused to concede to these protests that were breaking out. So in 1980 to 81, the prisoners organized another strike, the hunger strikes, which are very well known. And the hunger strikes, the prisoners refused to eat in prison. They would rather starve to death until they got back their special status and everything else. 10 prisoners ended up dying during the hunger strikes, including prisoner leader Bobby Sands, who actually won a British Parliament seat while he was incarcerated. And Sands had been he had been a leading prisoner in organizing the previous strikes. And his election while he was incarcerated, not so much his death, I mean, after his death, he became a martyr to the nationalist cause. But his his election while he was incarcerated kind of led and convinced the Sinn Féin party, which was very much the political arm of the IRA, to fight for unification, not just on the streets, but also on the ballot box to go into national politics. Sinn Féin party leader Gerry Adams would actually win a parliament seat in the elections of 1983 in order to represent West Belfast. But he refused to take that seat later when parliament went into session because doing so would have required him to take an oath of loyalty to Elizabeth II, the English queen, and he was not about to do that. So this is a picture here. Roll through a couple of these pictures. This is a picture of from Bloody Sunday back in 1972 during that massacre that ended up occurring. This was a picture from when that had occurred in Londonderry on Bloody Sunday. Excuse me. And then here we have an image of some British soldiers actually patrolling some streets. I believe this was taken in Belfast back. I think this one would have been about the 1980s, but them actually patrolling the streets to try to act as the security forces that had been called in. And then here we have an image. This is a picture of Bobby Sands. Bobby Sands was kind of the leader of multiple of these prison strikes by IRA prisoners. He ended up dying during the hunger strikes, became kind of a martyr, but he also managed to get elected to the British Parliament during his incarceration, which then kind of led Sinn Féin to get more involved with the Troubles period and getting, involved politically. And this is the picture here of one of the nationalist paramilitary groups. I don't believe these are IRA fighters. I believe this was another nationalist group that was formed, but this is a group of them. Many of them would wear masks. Many of them would they would act like official military regiments, really, and they were prepared to literally kill to achieve unification. In October of 1984, Thatcher and members of her Conservative Party were staying at the Brighton Hotel in Brighton, England. They weren't even in Ireland, but the IRA was so determined to send a message to the British government, the Provos staged an assassination attempt. They planted a bomb in the Brighton Hotel right at the time that Thatcher and her party members were staying there, and in the middle of the night, bomb blew up and killed 5 people and almost killed Thatcher. It was lucky that she had survived and actually blew a big, huge hole in the side of the hotel. This is the hotel after the explosion. This is the Brighton Hotel after that terrorist attack. This is where the bomb went off. After following that bomb attack, Thatcher actually ended up coming within the next year, coming to an agreement with the one of the local Irish leaders. She came into an agreement with the Irish Taoiseach, or I don't even know how to pronounce that really. I'm not even going to try. I'm just Trisha. I'm thinking I bet Trisha. I can't quite pronounce it. I don't speak Irish. I apologize. But she came into an agreement with the Irish. We're going to say Trisha. She came to an agreement with Garret Fitzgerald, who was pretty much the Irish prime minister. It's their version of a prime minister in their government. But Garret Fitzgerald ended up signing the Anglo-Irish Agreement with Thatcher in November of 1985. In this agreement, both Great Britain and Ireland agreed that no change would occur regarding Northern Ireland's status without the consent of a majority of its people. So that's already going to put a backfire to any plans by the Provo IRA and any other nationalist, paramilitary organizations that are seeking to achieve unification through force. That even if you manage to gain control, the Republic of Ireland and Great Britain are both agreeing that we're not going to change this unless a majority of the common people are seeking this change. They would also establish the Intergovernmental Conference that would give the Republic of Ireland a consultative role in Northern Ireland's political and security affairs. And power would only be devolved back to Northern Ireland. It would only be able to get its own self rule and parliament back if Unionists and Nationalists agreed to power sharing in a new government, which, of course, the Unionists are not willing to do. The Loyalists, in particular, are extremely opposed to the Anglo Irish Agreement, which would lead to more violence. 15 Unionist members of the House of Commons would actually resign in protest of this agreement that Thatcher had signed, and IRA bombings would then ensue in London, and Provos would also be killed as far away as the British territory of Gibraltar. In 1993, British Prime Minister John Major and Irish Taoiseach Albert Reynolds would actually issue the Downing Street Declaration. And in the Downing Street Declaration, it provided a framework for future peace talks to be established. The Provos would kind of actually go with this. And in 1994, having seen enough bloodshed, they kind of came like, it's time to come to the bargaining table. Provos would call for a ceasefire in 1994, along with several of the other loyalist paramilitary groups. However, this ceasefire would fall apart just 2 years later in 1996 due to Sinn Féin, the leading nationalist party, being excluded from those peace talks on the basis that there had been IRA bombings. There had been an IRA bombing campaign in, Northern Ireland and in England, and Sinn Féin insisted, hey, we should be part of these talks. And they're saying, well, you're kind of the political arm of the Provos or these other IRA groups. Why would we admit you when you're actively committing these bombing campaigns? The Unionists would remain ready to negotiate, however, and include the Republic of Ireland's participation in the negotiations as well. So, although the ceasefire briefly came to an end, talks would resume a year later in 1997, with Sinn Féin now included, along with the British and Irish governments and Unionist and nationalist political groups as well, which would lead peace eventually coming in 1998, which we'll show here in just 1 second. So here I have two final images here, just showing some other things you also would have saw at the time and during the Troubles period in Northern Ireland. This was a sign. It had a quote from Bobby Sands on it, but it would have been a Provo sign that would have been up on one of the walls showing one of their fighters masked holding their very iconic Atrams guns that they would have had. But it says resistance, and the quote that it has from Bobby Sands says that there can never be peace in Ireland until the foreign oppressive British presence is removed, leaving all the Irish people as a unit to control their own affairs and determine their own destinies as a sovereign people, free in mind and body, separate and distinct physically, culturally, and economically. And then here, this is just like a warning sign you might have seen walking on a street, where this one actually says "sniper at work," basically meaning don't come through here. There's a sniper nearby, and he may think that you're a provo. He may think that you're a unionist. He will, depending on which side it was, and they will shoot. The talks in 1997 would lead to what we know as the Good Friday Agreement that was agreed on April 10th of 1998. The Good Friday Agreement created a power-sharing Northern Irish Assembly. It would establish an institutional arrangement for cross-border cooperation between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. It would also lay the groundwork for further consultation between Great Britain and the Republic of Ireland. And a joint referendum was to be held on May 22nd of that year in both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland in order to determine whether or not this peace deal would be adopted. In the Republic of Ireland, 94% of voters approved of the Good Friday Agreement, while in Northern Ireland, about 71% of voters ended up approving, which was very much a majority. But breaking that 71% down, 96% of that majority that said yes were Catholics. About 96%, well, not that percent, but in Northern Ireland as a whole, 96% of Northern Irish Catholics were in favor of the Good Friday Agreement, while only barely over 50% of the Protestants were. Only 52% of the Protestants were in favor of it. Several small splinter groups from the IRA would end up breaking off from the Provos because the Provisional IRA did agree to the Good Friday Agreement. They agreed to partake in it. There were several small bands of fighters in the Provo IRA that were not willing to concede to the Good Friday Agreement, and they tried to carry out their own violence campaigns in an effort to continue, the troubles. They rapidly found out they were on their own and that they didn't really have the backing anymore of anybody. And one of those last notable bombings that did occur was a bombing at Omagh in August of 1998 that would end up killing 29. It was a car bomb that had been detonated. The IRA failure to decommission would end up delaying the formation of the new power sharing government in Northern Ireland to December of the following year, 1999, of which the Provo IRA would officially disarm. The Republic of Ireland would drop its sovereignty claim of the whole island of Ireland in its constitution, and the UK would yield direct control of Northern Ireland and go back to a local Northern Irish government. What complicated the process after the Good Friday Agreement was the decommissioning of the paramilitary units, and the Provo IRA was a very long, drawn out, and slow process. They were very slow to actually decommission and disarm, and it took a number of years before that actually was complete. And there was still quite a bit of antagonism between the two sides in the years that followed. The IRA would officially announce in July of 2005 in order to dump arms and only pursue future change through peaceful means in the terms of the unification of Ireland they still wanted. A power sharing government would be formed in 2007 in Northern Ireland as the Sinn Féin and DUP parties would reach an agreement after winning a majority of seats in the Northern Irish Parliament. I believe I think it was just last year. Last year, I know it broke headlines because in Northern Ireland, that was founded as a Protestant Unionist Loyalist state, just last year, just in January of 2024, the leader of the government in Northern Ireland was a member of Sinn Féin, which is an Irish Republican party. That was absolutely astounding. And for the first time, Catholics are starting to outnumber Protestants in Northern Ireland. So there is still the question nowadays, is the troubles going to is it going to start up again, or is the possibility coming at some point in the near future that we could be looking at the possibility of a united Ireland? I personally would like to see a united Ireland, but I do understand the concerns of the Protestants that live in Northern Ireland. I do understand what they're saying at the same time. But I do think overall, I think their fears are slightly over exaggerated, but I can't say it for sure because I don't live there. I have not experienced what they've gone through. But I hope that maybe one day, if I can actually go to Ireland, maybe I can get a little bit more of the kind of the feeling from the people of what the situation is and how they interpret, what they think should happen in the near future. But that concludes for the Troubles. So, as I said, it officially ended in 1998 after about 30 years, but it still had stuff going on until about 2005, 2007 ish. And very recently, we're starting to see a little bit more of antagonism starting to build up again, which, for those that can remember the Troubles and those that grew up during that time frame, I'm sure is quite terrifying. Out of the fear is it going to erupt again? So that concludes for this video. So if anyone has any questions, any comments, anything they'd like to add, feel free to put it in the comment section and I'll be more than happy to look through them when I can. As for next week, for our last video of January, it of course will be our president's video, which will be for this month. We're going on to the 30th president. We're covering Calvin Coolidge, so that'll be next week. So as always, I hope everyone has a good rest of their week, a good week going into the weekend, and we'll see you all back here next week for the next video.